My name is Dick Cavanaugh, and I'm the Executive Dean of the Kennedy School. And it is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce the 58th Godkin Lecturer at Harvard University. For those of you who are not familiar with the Godkin Lecture, it was established in 1903, named in honor of the founder of The Nation magazine, whose current editor is currently in residence at the Kennedy School. This is a lecture that has had distinguished people giving these lectures since 1904. They have included Lord Bryce, Walter Lippmann, Gunnar Myrdal, and 3 valedictory addresses by former Harvard presidents, Presidents Eliot, Conant, and Bach. Derek Bach did this last year. Our lecturer this year is a person who I suspect is known to everyone here, since this is an overpacked crowd, Peter Drucker. Professor Drucker was born in 1909 in Austria. He has been an economist, a correspondent, an editor, and a professor. He has been a professor of philosophy, social science, management, and Japanese art, respectively. So much for specialization. He is generally considered to be the foremost scholar of management and also in the workings of the independent sector. He has only published 28 books. They have only been published in 20 languages. 12 of them had to do with society, economics, and government, such as The Age of Discontinuity. 12 of them had to do with management, books like Managing for Results and The Effective Executive. 2 of them were novels. 1 was an autobiography, and 1 was a book on Japanese painting. Usually when you give these introductions, you say that so-and-so has received honorary doctorates from blank, blank, and blank. In his case, we have to do it by country, because there are so many. He has received honorary doctorates from colleges and universities in the United States, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Japan, Spain, and Switzerland. And tomorrow, we'll receive one in Ohio. Professor Drucker is married to a physicist. He has 4 children, whom he has fathered. Although if you read the popular press, if you read, for example, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, The Economist, or the Harvard Business Review, you would also read that he has fathered a 5th child, that 5th child being modern management. Let me quote from a recent article about in the Harvard Business Review. By the way, at the Harvard Business Review, Professor Drucker has contributed more articles than any other writer. They write to their favorite correspondent. Sometimes called the father of modern management, he combines an acute understanding of socioeconomic forces with practical insights into how leaders can turn turbulence into opportunity. With a rare gift for synthesis, Drucker nourishes his insatiable mind on a full range of intellectual disciplines, from Japanese art to network theory and higher economics. Yet he learns most from his in-depth conversations with clients and students, a global network of men and women who draw their ideas from action and act on ideas. End quote. So we are fortunate this evening to have with us a man of ideas and a man of action. And therefore I am pleased to present Professor Peter Drucker, who will do the 58th Godkin lecture. Professor Drucker.
Thank you very much, Dean Kavanaugh. And I hope you don't mind if I say that whenever my wife hears that I'm called the father of modern management, she asks, and who was the mother? Because while there is virgin birth, you do need a mother. And she, being an honest physicist, disclaims to have anything to do with as unprecise, as unscientific as management. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a very great honor and a great pleasure to be here and to see so many people in this room who were my teachers, my mentors, the people I admire, the people from whom I heard so much. And I feel not only greatly honored, but I think this is a very great occasion for me just to look around and see so many people to whom I owe so much. And let me say that my title, as you probably know, is A Century of Social Transformations. And believe me, this century is one of the bloodier ones in human history, but all centuries of human history have been pretty bloody. And when you try, as I'm an old statistician, I once taught that dubious subject, if you try to compare this century with others, with all its horror and its meanness, it's a mean century, and all its bloodshed and holocausts and ethnic cleansing, it isn't too different from the typical human century. Human history is not the most, shall we say, satisfying record. But when it comes to society, there has been no history that can even remotely compare to this one. When Lord Bryce in 1904, 90 years ago, gave the fourth Godkin lecture 5 years before I was born, there was no country in the world in which farmers were not the largest single occupational group, not necessarily the majority anymore. And the second largest one was something you younger people only see in museums or in 1920 movies, live-in domestic servants. There were 22% of the labor force in the UK, and about the same proportion in this country. Next group were independent craftsmen and small tradesmen. That group hasn't disappeared. You know, the farmers are down to 3% in this country. There's no developed country where there are more than 7%, and most of those people don't farm. They receive government subsidies. And domestic servants, your younger people have heard of them. But they are very much like knights in shining armor, you know, there's something you hear about. And the tradesmen and small craftsmen are still here, but proportionately they are less than 1/4 of the working population they were 90 years ago. And the fourth largest group in developed countries then were blue-collar industrial workers. They were about 1/6, 1/7. They were just beginning their rise. And as you all know, they rose meteorically. Till around 1950 or so in all developed countries, blue-collar workers who made and moved things manually were a majority of the labor force. And no group in history has ever risen as fast, and no group in history has ever fallen as fast. 40 years later, they are back to where they were in 1900. And will you please allow me to say one thing? Practically everybody believes still that industrial production and industrial employment are the same thing. When you listen to Washington, when I came in the late 1940s, when the rise in farm productivity really took off and the drop in farm employment really began, we had a hard time for a few years to realize that the two things are not the same thing. And today we had 26% of the American workforce still on the farm when Professor Galbraith and I left Washington at the end of World War II. And now it's 3%. All right, you multiply, population has increased 4.5-fold. So that's basically we have 1/3 as many people on the land. But our farm production is 6 or 7 times what it was in 47 or 48. So farm productivity and farm production and farm employment are not the same. And we are now learning this about manufacturing employment and manufacturing production. They are not the same. And by American manufacturing production has risen in the last 20 years as fast as any other country, as fast as Japan, 2.5 times. Germany, 26%. UK, less than 20%. We have had an extraordinarily successful manufacturing production, but accompanied by the sharpest drop in labor force, as sharp as the one in farmers between 1950 and 1980. But manufacturing production is doing beautifully. It's manufacturing employment that is down. And the blue-collar worker has fallen as fast in the last 30 years as he had risen, or she, mostly he, as had risen in the first 50 years, and we are down to where blue-collar people making and moving things are only down to 1/6, 1/7 what they were when Lord Bryce gave the first Godkin lecture, or when I was born. And they are going down. And so this has been the century of social transformations. Nothing like this has ever happened before. And my hunch is that this century, I think, has been proving the futility of politics. One probably shouldn't say that in a school called School of Government. But government has not been the success story of this century. It's been growing very fast. But in accomplishments, when I look at the Victorians, they did better. This is not, in retrospect, I think future historians may well conclude that the things that make all the headlines, sound and fury signifying nothing, a lot of blood spilled, achieving nothing, and that the real events of this century were the unprecedented change in the labor force. Will you accept the fact that for, make it 10,000 years, agriculturalists and domestic servants were civilization? They were 80%. And that great English census of 1910 that for the first time tried to define socio-economic categories, defined lower middle class as a family that cannot afford to have more than 3 servants. Anybody in this room is above lower middle class? And so we have two new classes, unknown to history, who are now our central workforce. And the smaller of the one, but the dominant one, are knowledge people. The likes of us in this room, who are getting paid for what we supposedly learned in school. And I hope for the younger ones in this room are going to get paid well. And services people, they overlap. About 2/5 knowledge people, 3/5 services people, there's an overlap. And they are the new classes, and they are unknown to social history. And altogether our society is not only unknown to social history, it's still unknown to sociologists. And I'm going to talk today, in the short time I have, on only one part of it, which is the emerging knowledge society, the emerging knowledge worker. And let me say that I have 5 kind of chapter headings. One, the emerging knowledge society and the knowledge worker. One, that new unit of social integration, which we call the organization, which is a term none of us before World War II ever heard or used. And then talking about the new, well, don't call it governing function. It is not the right word. We don't have a word. The new function of this society of organization, which we call management. Call it administration, probably, on this side of the Charles River. But that's purely a semantic choice. And then I'm going to talk about something nobody yet pays attention to, that knowledge work totally changes the social community. And finally, I'm going to say a few words on our challenges ahead. All this in a few minutes, so I'll really more sketch things. You'll have a chance to read the text of the lecture, which is a little longer, but even so, I'm trying to sketch things. And when you look at the emerging knowledge society, one of the amazing new things is that the access to decent jobs and careers now requires formal schooling. This is brand new. This is unknown in history. At the time at which the first Godkin lecture was given, if all men of knowledge had been wiped out by the intellectual equivalent of AIDS, there must be such a thing. Not sexually transmitted, but transmitted probably through a computer program. And if all of them had been wiped out, nobody would have noticed it. Believe me, if you want to understand what I'm saying, the greatest clinician of that time, who had this, was known as well in the world and as Einstein was in the 60s, was a Canadian physician. His name was Osler, Bill Osler, who founded Johns Hopkins Medical School, and in 1906, just about the theme of the Godkin lecture, was appointed Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford, and he was a celebrity, and the reporters swarmed around him and said, Dr. Osler, in your 30 years of medical practice, what has changed in medicine? And Osler said, if a patient now goes to a competent physician, and I underline the word competent, he has as much of a chance to be helped as to be harmed. That's not the story. When the Regius Professor of Medicine in Cambridge read that in the London Times the next day, he had known Osler all his life. He chuckled and said, Bill Osler has always been an optimist. So that was basically, the knowledge was a slight ornament on the structure of a society that was solidly based on people doing manual work, skilled or unskilled, mostly unskilled. And so the knowledge worker is something brand new. No society before could ever afford that many people of knowledge. You know, when I was make it third grade and came home with my report card, my grandmother looked at it and said, "Peter, unless you improve those grades, you'll have to become a plumber." Well, this was before there were plastic pipes, and I had seen plumbers. So I improved my grades. And so the one purpose of going to school and staying it was never having to do honest work. It still largely is, if I look at my graduate students, or at least postpones that evil day. But now there are the key, knowledge is our key economic resource. Basically, you don't compete with cheap labor anymore. The idea that cheap labor imports are important is an illusion. This country imports 12% of GNP, less than 2.5% from low-wage countries, and half of that are manufactured imports. They are irrelevant. Our main competitors come from countries with wages higher than ours, Japan and Germany, and not from low-wage countries. You can't compete with low-wage anymore, except in tiny little islands of yesterday. The competition is going to be on the productivity of knowledge, which, by the way, is unbelievably low. I've been teaching since I was 20, 65 years, during which time I can assure you the productivity of university faculties has not measurably improved. Whether it has gone down or not, thank God we don't have any measures. But it hasn't improved. That's our big economic challenge, is the productivity of knowledge work, and we're beginning to go to work. And it's new. For the first time, in order to have access to decent jobs, when I told my father, I come from a family of physicians and lawyers and civil servants, that I wasn't going to go to the university. I'd been sitting on my rear end in school for 12 years and hadn't learned anything. I didn't see any point in prolonging the agony. He didn't say you're going to be a dropout. He wasn't very happy. But no, I was a responsible adult. He didn't say you'll never get any place. That's mid-20s. No. Will you please accept the fact that of all the big businessmen of 19th century America, only one ever went to college? J.P. Morgan went to Göttingen to study mathematics and dropped out after one term because he came to the conclusion that people are more interesting than equations. He was the only one. Most of the rest hadn't finished elementary school. And the Civil Service Commission put in a requirement for having finished high school in 1923. Before that, so this is very new. Access to effectiveness and contribution now requires formal schooling, and consider many years of it. And secondly, equally important, is that it's not knowledge, it's knowledges. One of the problems we have is that our educational system still looks at knowledge, and our young people quite rightly look for knowledges, because basically the knowledge that is effective is highly specialized, incredibly specialized. And how do we, it's one of the big challenges for an old school master like myself, how do we still create a common core so that there is such a thing as a discourse, a civilized discourse? And I don't know the answer. And one of the things also is because these people are so highly specialized and have to be, they have to have access to an organization. That doesn't mean that they have to be employees. They have to have access to an organization, because only by putting together a fistful of knowledges do you get any performance. Individual knowledge is totally ineffectual. The surgeon needs, the neurosurgeon needs somebody to make the diagnosis. But also when you look at this neurosurgeons then operating, this is a team. There is the surgeon and an assistant surgeon and 3 to 5 highly trained nurses, and then an anesthetist or a practitioner, a nurse anesthetist, and 3 electronic engineers, and they perform. The surgeon is a team leader. And will you please also accept the fact that most of today's talk about teams is stupid and dangerous. Stupid. It assumes first that we never worked in teams. There are some solo performers. When Professor Galbraith or I sit down to write a book, we are very much alone. But we still need a publisher. But most work has always been done in teams. And there was not one team, but about half a dozen. And one of the things we will have to look, this is the beginning of the baseball season. How are the Red Sox doing? Well, so far, I don't know. I'm an old baseball fan. Beginning of the baseball season, and when you look at a baseball team, that fellow on the third base is never going to come to the help of the pitcher. He's not even going to come to the help of the second baseman. And there's an old saying that nobody is as alone as a fellow up at bat. And yet it's a team. And it has enormous strength in that you can train every one of these people individually in doing what he is good at. The coach isn't trying to make a batter out of a pitcher, but he's training him to be a pitcher. And as you all know, there are statistics on every baseball player going back to year 1 on everything. And you can measure and appraise and improve them. And when you look at the team, all of you people love the jazz combo team. You can't do that. They are very difficult, and their performance is likely to be mediocre because they cut corners. And they are very, so, but still people have to work in teams, because individually that market researcher produces data. He doesn't even produce information. That takes marketing and salespeople, and to produce a business strategy takes a management. And the same is equally true of the team in the labs not very far from here that work on biochemistry. The biochemist doesn't know zilch about genetics, and yet he needs it. So we have to learn to work in teams, what team is appropriate for what task, what discipline, and so on. These are big challenges which we don't yet quite understand, or at least work on. But also, let me say, this is a very different society for the individual. It is probably the most competitive society one could devise. You go back 100 years, and society was not competitive. Most people followed, even in a country of high mobility like the US, most people followed their father. And if you were the son of a working man and you became a working man, nobody said you are a failure or you're a dropout. You were a good provider. And today you have to be a success. And that means also that you can fail. No society has ever been so competitive, and one of our very great challenges is to, which is why I am beginning to be very dubious about business schools, is to get across, to get satisfaction and achievement and call it fulfillment, and to downgrade success simply because statistics, there are few, even a democratic president cannot suspend the laws of arithmetic. If you look at it, the statistics are very clear that for every success there have to be about 7 to 9 failures, even in a rapidly expanding economy. And so how do you basically create satisfaction with achievement rather than with success? This is a challenge no society ever had, simply because there was no such thing as success. The number of people in the most mobile society, we have plenty of studies, who came out of the college class into which they were born was that small. In the most mobile society, which was probably the UK around 1840, probably. US was never quite that mobile. And so we have a new knowledge society, but we have a new knowledge worker, and he is a very peculiar critter. He's employed, but he is not Marx proletarian. He is also the capitalist. Through pension funds, mutual funds, what have you, the employees own the means of production in the economist sense of the word, the financial means. But far more important, they own the tools of production because they are between their ears. And so the knowledge worker has mobility and horizon and self-confidence. And I'm always being asked by my friends and clients, how do we manage the new breed? The answer is look at the non-profits, how they attract and manage volunteers, because the knowledge worker by definition is a volunteer. He can go any place and does. He has information, he has horizon, he has self-confidence, and that fellow who can write software can go any place. And so can that fellow who can do cost accounting. And so can that fellow who can do neurosurgery. And so can that fellow who knows a little bit about medieval history. All right, markets are not always good, but over any 5 years periods, these are cyclical. And they have mobility. And so you look at what makes so many people, 1 out of every 2 of the American adults, work as volunteer for a non-profit. What attracts them to the church, to the Girl Scouts, to the Battered Women's Shelter, to the American Heart Association? These are busy people. What makes them willing to spend 5 hours a week working without pay? What motivates them, what attracts them, what holds them? That's what we will have to learn. Let me shift to the organization. It is not necessarily that everybody will be an employee. In fact, it is likely that fewer and fewer people will be employees. more and more people will work as contractors, as consultants, let alone that they aren't going to work downtown where the office building is more and more. But they will have to work with an organization and get paid by it. And so the organization will become a society of organizations. You go back those 90 years, there were none. Big corporations were just beginning. The labor union was in its infancy. The hospital was a place where my great uncle put his patients, these poor patients, to die, and so on. And today, every social task is being done through an organization. And as I told you, that word is still not known by sociologists. You read the great sociologist, Tönnies, a German, probably wrote the key book in 1888 on modern sociology, or Max Weber, or Wright Mills. They don't mention organization. And organization before, make it 1950, meant an act, not a, what is it? Is it a reality? Not a social unit. We said, let's get organized, yes, but organization, the way we use the term now, was unknown as late as 1950, 1960. No, and even then we at first saw only the business enterprise. It took a long time for us to realize that Harvard University is also an organization, and that the labor union is one, and the churches are one, the government agency is one, except they have far more in common than they are different. And we don't really quite know what it is. We are just beginning to study it, except it's not the society, and it's not the community, or not the family. The term sociologists use. The Japanese after World War II tried to make the business a family, a community. It hasn't worked. It's falling to pieces. We tried half-heartedly, not very much. It's not the community, it's not the family, but it's also not just a loose relationship. For most people who spend their working hours, the largest single part of the day, it's a reality. It's not the reality. They're also volunteers. They also have a family. It doesn't encompass them the way yesterday's community did. But it is not entirely. It's contractual, it's voluntary, but it is not, it's more than just a cash nexus, far more. We don't quite understand it. We are beginning to work on it, and let me say, since we are at the Kennedy School, the only person who has ever done any work on it was a member of this faculty, was George Hohmann's 35, 40 years ago, with his work on the small group and so on. And he tried to kind of come to grips with organization. Nobody has really done any work since. I've been trying, but I'm not saying that I'm terribly pleased with it. And so that we have a knowledge society, a society of organizations, and we have a new employee, well, maybe who's dependent on the organization, even though we may not be employed by it. And will you please accept that more and more we will work with people who work for us and work with us, and yet are not our employees, in outsourcing, in alliances, as suppliers, and where most people are used to manage. The only people who manage or try to manage, the way we will have to manage yesterday, are university deans, because they have absolutely no power and yet have to get things done. By persuasion, by understanding what that professor really tries to do. They are our models, and having been one myself, I can assure you it's not a particularly inspiring model. It means, there's an old saying in machine design that if more than 30% of the energy go into friction, you better redesign the model. Well, on that basis, being a dean is more like 70% is friction. And so, all right, we have to learn to work with people whom we cannot command. The old assumption of the 19th century, it wasn't just Marx, it was everybody, that the worker needs a job worse than the employer needs the worker, no longer applies. And we will have to learn that. And at the same time, these people are dependents. They are dependent on the access to the organization. But they are also the capitalists. When I came up, the one thing on which all economists agree, and you all know that we will not have economists who really can do economics until the next step in evolution, when we are going to breed human beings with 3 hands, so that they can say on the one hand, on the other hand, and on the third hand, that. But till then, we will not have economists, really. But the one thing on which all 3 hands agreed was that there is a wage fund and there's a capital fund, and the two are separate. And in the modern economy, the two are the same. The pension fund is deferred wage, and yet it's our main source of capital. And we don't understand this, bluntly. We are beginning to. But these are not things that we are used to. They are so new. They are so contrary to everything we have known for, make it 10,000 years. These are really new things. Killing people is very old. But these are new things. And also equally new is the emergence of that new organ. We call it management or administration. Most people, when they hear the word management, still hear business management, because a large business was the first modern organization to arise around 1870. It was totally unprecedented and shocking. You have no idea how shocked our ancestors were by it. As late as 1926, America's most prominent labor economist in Wisconsin published a book in which she asserted that the corporation is the result of a conspiracy between the financial people and the Supreme Court. It didn't occur to him that without Supreme Court, every other developed country had developed the corporation. But it was still shocking. That book should have been laughed out of court, instead of which it became a bestseller and one of the most influential books in the 30s. His name was Commons, John Commons. The new big business was a shocker, because it violated all the axioms of the liberal creed, liberal with a small L. And one big organization after the other has arisen since. And each needs management, which is a new function. It's a rulership or leadership function, which is quite peculiar, because individually even the most powerful executive is a non-person. If that fellow who is now on the cover of Business Week retires next week and goes back to his office a week later, the guard will say, "Where is your ID?" and 2 weeks later he's a non-person. He is not powerful at all, the officers. He's a non-person. And individually, even the most powerful of them, nothing. Collectively, they are the only decision-making, leadership, rulership group we have. And they have not yet accepted that. They don't see that. What that means in terms of individually you are nobody. Collectively you represent. That wasn't true, and also most of those people till they are 50 are subordinates. Most of yesterday's rulers were princes when they were in diapers and were treated that way and brought up, that way. And they are gone, yesterday's rulers, who were used to rulership for better or worse, usually for worse, but still. And the new group are employees. They are themselves subordinates, and yet they represent. And we know a little bit about it, but not enough. And the biggest change is one which is a result of knowledge having become the key resource. It is much more important than any of the things I've talked about. Perhaps, I'm not sure yet. Throughout history, men and women have had the same participation in the workforce. In fact, a farmer had to have a wife, and a farm wife had to have a husband. You couldn't run a farm alone. And that upholsterer had to have a wife, and his wife had to have a husband. You couldn't run the shop alone. And when Johann Sebastian Bach took the job as cantor in Leipzig and running the choir school, his contract specified that if his wife dies, he has to remarry within 90 days. For the simple reason that there were 36 little boys in that choir school, and somebody had to cut their sandwiches and tuck them in and write their letters home to them and physics them when they were sick. And when he was 35, his first wife died, and he had no great interest in women. At that time he was busy writing music. A wife was a distraction. And so he wanted to hire a housekeeper and was willing to pay her out of his own pocket. And the Senate of Leipzig said, "Look, my boy, you either marry tomorrow or you're out." And he did marry. You could not possibly run anything alone. But historically, the only jobs in which men and women did the same work were the lowest menial jobs requiring no skill and conferring no income and no social distinction. Digging ditches, carrying heavy loads on a building site, that men and women did together. The moment you had the slightest social distinction, jobs were gender defined. There has never been a male spinster. Until 1870, when my great-grandfather started the first arts and crafts school in Vienna, there never has been a woman weaver. And that school was started primarily so that young, bright women wouldn't demand to go to the university. That was the main purpose. And the good ladies of Vienna went to the emperor and demanded that he be fired because he allowed women to be weavers. That was unladylike. And the emperor fired him. And no woman ever touched a potter's wheel till the arts and crafts school. All jobs were gender defined, women competed with women, men competed with men. That is not just advanced societies. When Bronislaw Malinowski, the great anthropologist, in the years of World War I, studied the Trobriand Islands in the Pacific, it's really the first classical work of anthropology. The men built the boats and manned them and caught the fish. The women tilled the fields and grew the yam and the tapioca, and the men turned over 50% of the fish catch to the women, and the women 50% of the yams to the men. And that, the first knowledge profession, new knowledge profession created, which was nursing. When Florence Nightingale invented nursing in 1854, she still saw it primarily as a woman's profession. Today, 40% of the nursing students in the US are men. The next knowledge profession, which was teaching, was already both sexes, men and women, competing, working together and competing. Since World War II, this has become a flood. This may be the first women doctors by 1890. First one was in Austria, my Aunt Trudy. The second in Italy. The third one was my mother. And so that was in the 1890s, my mother in 1900. Since then it's become a flood. Because in knowledge work there are no gender differentiations. This is not feminism. This is the nature of the work. What this means we don't know yet. But for instance, it is now possible for a woman not to have a husband or a man and have children. And I'm not so sure for you women that that's a brilliant idea, because it means that the men also don't feel responsible anymore, which may not be the most brilliant idea you ever had in your lives. And the men, so basically, but look, throughout the ages, the one thing women resisted was any attempt to deprive them of the primary responsibility for their children. There's a very bitter Greek play in which the women of Sparta complain of the macho. The real oppression is that Spartan boys at age 6 were taken away from their parents and taken into a child care center. And now it is a feminist cause to have child care centers in which a non-mother takes care of the child. Those are very profound changes, for better or worse, and I think we don't understand them. They change the community. They change what family means. And perhaps of all the social transformations, the ones I've talked about mainly are what work we do. But the last one is who does the work. And that may be an even greater change. We have some social problems in this new society. The biggest, there are two. One is three, if you please. The productivity of knowledge work. We are just beginning to work on it. The problem of creating teams that are satisfied. It can be done. Look at the symphony orchestra. That bassoon player never wants to become the first violin. He's perfect. He wants, so it can be done. There are no promotional opportunities in a symphony orchestra. Well, all right, you are the second trumpet, you may become the first trumpet, but that's it. You are not going to become conductor or first violin. And yet people are very satisfied. The most satisfied people I've worked with are symphony orchestras. But it takes a very different approach to what you contribute. Sure, that trumpet player complains all the time that whatever we play, there's never a good enough trumpet part in it. That's what you want him to do. It is not impossible, but we haven't even started. We're still looking at promotion as recognition. And there are very few promotional opportunities in the knowledge society. Organizations are flat. And so that is number one. Number two is the productivity of service work. Because unless we can make service work productive, we cannot pay them. And the gaps, therefore, between knowledge work that is, in many cases, very well paid, if not overpaid. I'm just now hiring faculty. And service work, which is paid more than its productivity deserves, but far less than most knowledge work, there is the danger of a new, call it a class conflict, which only raising the productivity of knowledge work, of service work, the way we raised the productivity of manual work in the last 120 years can possibly bridge. But I have a sneaking suspicion, it's not more than that the greatest single change is not in the things the change in what work is being done with knowledge as the key resource rather than manual work. The greatest change may be the disappearance of the gender definition of jobs in knowledge work. In the other things, we change the way we make our living. In changing the gender definition in knowledge work, we may change the way we live, and that in the long analysis may be far more important, though I don't think any one of us yet can predict whether the experiment will work. This is a new experiment, takes a couple of 100 years. We see the last experiment in that area, the bourgeois housewife sitting at home doing nothing, has not worked. So one can't, 100 years, but we now know that it's a limited success. So you can't yet say that the new one will work. It's an experiment. Wait 100 years, 50 perhaps. But if it works, and I have a suspicion it will make a much more fundamental change in the human condition than any of the other things I talked about. And these are some of the basic and outlines, chapter headings on a century of social transformations. And I hope that I didn't condense it too much, and I hope that at the same time I gave you enough material to ask questions. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Let me describe the ground rules for questions and answers. Because we're not deconstructionists here, a question must end with a question mark at some point. What we would also like is for those of you who have questions to identify yourself and tell us something briefly about yourself, and then ask your question. And what I will do is, as you ask your question, there are two microphones, one on each side here on the first floor. I will repeat it so others can hear it. And we'll go to my left and your right first.
Hi, I'm Brian Goffman. I'm a student at the business school across the river.
You have come across without a visa?
Might repeat that.
Derek Bach has written a book about the cost of talent, and the wage gaps between professional workers and specialists versus others in other areas like government and education. How much of a problem do you think that is? And if it is a problem, do you think we need to do something about it?
Okay, the question is, Derek Bach, the Godkin lecturer of last year, wrote a book based on his Godkin lecture on the differentiation between high-cost professions and low-cost professions. And this man's question is that a sustainable differentiation? Is that basically it?
In other words, Derek Bach has said that he thinks that that's a long-run problem that creates a social gap. Do you think that's the case?
Look, so far it hasn't. So far, the people who go into library work, who are very poorly paid compared to, let's say, people who go into biochemistry, they complain very bitterly. But still, people go into library work. And it doesn't pay that badly. So basically, when you come to knowledge work, that problem, I know I hear it all the time, that problem has not become an acute social problem. Fundamentally because very few people go to the Harvard Business School and therefore consider money to be the most important thing.
This man may need a follow-up.
My follow-up would be that it's not just business students that are going into professions for money, but also you might even look at some of the PhD students from the physics department that are going to Wall Street, or the neuroscientists who are earning very large salaries. It's more of a question of how knowledge is becoming so valuable that it's somehow attracting talent into fields that might not be the most productive for our society. For example, teachers, lawyers.
It probably isn't, but will you accept the fact that any attempt to direct people into professions and careers has been a disaster? In part because most of us in this room did not know where we belonged till we were well past 30. Then somehow the finger of providence pushes you and you fall into your slot. There are only 3 professions in which you have to start at age 5: mathematicians, musicians, and cooks. And the rest you don't know. I always have to tell my students that their first job is not their lifetime decision. The first job is a job which within 3 years they will have outgrown. And you don't know where people are going to go. And 10 years later, if you look at the people over 35 in this room, most of them high achievers, not one of them knew at age 25 where he would or she would end up. Beginning with myself, I had no idea till I was in my 30s, early 30s. I did a lot. I went to work before I was 18. I did a lot of things, and some I enjoyed greatly. But it takes a lot of time. And in part because that physicist who is in Wall Street is in Wall Street not because Wall Street pays more money, but because his postdoc grant at MIT has run out, and there are no academic jobs. He still feels that he would much rather be an assistant professor on the tenure track at MIT at $27,500 a year rather than make 90,000 in Wall Street. But there are at present very few jobs for physicists. You know, the end of the nuclear of the collider in Texas, there are 1,000 PhDs in physics who have lost their jobs. So they take Wall Street jobs. But they still would, good many of, sure, some will stay in Wall Street and make a lot of money and prefer it, but a good many, if a decent physics job in a research university opens up, will make a beeline back. Because fundamentally, and I know quite a few, they are terribly bored by those Wall Street jobs. For a physicist, they are boring. There's no excitement in it. There's also nobody has gotten a Nobel Prize yet in Wall Street. So will you please not try? Look, there's a few simple rules. One is the good Lord does not need a management consultant. And secondly, providence cannot be controlled from this side. No, I'm serious. And one doesn't plan careers. One says, what am I good at? And tries to become better. And then, in most cases, I see a lot of people, friends of mine, of whose history I know in this room. I can assure you not one of them has reached his eminence and distinction by doing the things they started out to do. Not a one. I see in front of me a dean who started out as a nuclear physicist, and our most distinguished living American economist who started out as an agricultural economist. And I started out, if you want to know, selling padlocks to India from Bradford in Yorkshire. So don't worry. Find out. Look, there are two rules. First, don't try to postpone the inevitable. One cannot learn to swim by the side of the pool. Go to work. Don't spend years finding yourself. Leave that to your girlfriend. And the second rule, no, I'm serious. Find out what you are good at and find out the place where it can make a contribution. And the rest, providence will take care of it. I'm serious.
You want to go to the right here.
Hello, my name is Linda, and I teach English as a second language at a nonprofit organization where I first started out as a volunteer 4 years ago. And so this organization is now paying me, and incidentally, I started out in radio several years back, and I couldn't have foreseen then what I would be doing now. You read a lot about competition. I personally don't read an awful lot about cooperation. About 10 years ago, I wrote a book by a local author, and I'm sorry to say I don't remember his name, but the title of the book is No Contest, in which he makes a case for cooperation over competition. Would you like to comment on that?
I think I got it.
Okay.
Look, you remember, no, you don't. But a good many of you remember when we had talked about competitive coexistence with the Soviet Union. Remember, that was much easier than cooperation with the Soviet Union successor. The competition and cooperation are not in conflict. They are two different poles of the same thing. You need both. You cooperate and you compete. And there's a lot, sure. To look upon things as being either zero games or non-zero games is very good mathematics and very poor economics and even poorer psychology. Most things are both. And so when do you cooperate? With whom? Most of the things you need to accomplish, you cannot accomplish alone. Very few things can be accomplished alone. You know, I almost became a professional musician, and there was one great musician who made his living playing a solo instrument alone, Pablo Casals, who played the Bach and accompanied suites. All the other cellists had to have either a quartet or an orchestra. There's not much you can do as a solo cellist alone. And yet, they were in competition, all those cellists, with the other cellists for the few first-class engagements. So you have both. And don't look upon it as being in conflict. The question is, you always balance. Yes, it's a very competitive society, not because it's more competitive than it ever was, but because we have come to the, I think, asinine belief that everybody has to be a success. The pressure on young people is unbearable. Thank God I'm not 20 anymore, because at my time there was very little of that pressure. Okay, in my family it was a family of doctors and lawyers and so on, but even there it wasn't that great, and today the pressure is very great. Maybe too great, not maybe, certainly. On the other hand, and therefore many more people can be successful, but that also means that many more cannot be. And then though it's perhaps too competitive, and if you want to see the extreme, look at Japan with that insane system of pressure on young people, which does permanent damage. And on the other hand, there's more and more cooperation. It's no accident that we talk so much about teams, because we are learning more and more that my own little specialty, whether that's playing the clarinet or being a metallurgist, by itself produces no results. So you have to learn, I think we're in the early stages, to have two hands, to be ambidextrous. But don't look upon these two things. The more competition you have, the more cooperation you need. We have infinitely more cooperation today than society ever knew. Nobody cooperated yesterday. That farmer in Minnesota did not cooperate with anybody. He grew his own red wheat, the Red River Valley, his own hard wheat, alone. His wife, he had maybe hired hand, no cooperation. The small craftsmen, no cooperation. This is the most cooperative society the world has ever seen. Most people work in cooperation, and yet in competition. Those two things are complementary. They are not in conflict. Okay?
We have a question from the center microphone from Professor Galbraith, a former Fortune journalist who I believe has something to ask you. And then we'll go to the others.
I have a very deep, searching question. It goes back a matter of 40-odd years to nearly one of the very early Godkin lectures. It was given by a very distinguished senator from Vermont, Ralph Flanders, great figure in his time. We had a dinner for him beforehand at the faculty club. There were 14 there. We had a very interesting discussion. We moved to then Lowell Hall, now being rejuvenated, and the same audience of 14 were there and no others. Comparing that with the audience tonight, wouldn't you say that this is proof that the knowledge industry is expanding?
I have known Professor Goldberg for more years than either he or I would like to remember. And he always asks those disagreeable questions. The question is, are you talking quantity or quality? When you talk about Senator Flanders and hold him against today's Senate, I wouldn't say that the knowledge population has improved. I was a Vermonter at the time and voted for him. I ran a small women's college up in Vermont. That improvement, no, that's been going the wrong direction, I'm afraid. When you look, on the other hand, at the students, and I've been teaching since 1929, when I wasn't quite 20, and I discovered all my childhood, everybody had always said, "Shush, Peter, you talk too much." And suddenly, my professor of international relations called me. I was a young journalist, studied law on the side, and said, "I'm sick, can you take my class?" And I found, to my great surprise, that somebody was willing to listen, or at least forced to listen. It was a required course. And let me say, when I look at the students, the improvement is incredible. Not in quality is the wrong word. They're reaching out. If you go back even 40 years, they were so narrow. They were so isolated. They were so parochial. So inflexible. No, I think wouldn't you agree, Ken? I think you can say that they're tremendous. Look, I was in China a few years ago on a World Bank mission, and one of the things I looked at was Chinese higher education. They have 1.5 million students in a population of 1,300,000,000, which, if you translate it into American terms, is about 400,000 students, and not 12.5 million. And I brought this up with the people in the government, but let me also say that most incredibly bright people. Most of them are in Beijing because the regime doesn't trust students out of its. Chinese are very afraid of students. Most of them study economics to become government economists, which is the greatest hope we have that China is not going to be a serious competitor. And no engineering students. And I brought this to the attention of work with the Prime Minister, and he said, we have as many students proportionately as the US said at the same stage of its development in 1926. I'm not sure that you can develop unless you change that. But yes, what he basically said, we have increased our student population 25-fold in the last 70 years in this country. Population has increased 4-fold, so it's only a 6-fold increase proportionately. And that means both that we have enormously broadened, not just quantity, but quality. And it means at the same time that we have problems, because we have scaled up education, and you can't scale up anything 5-fold without it getting out of whack. We have to rethink again. And as you probably know, thinking is the most difficult thing at human. My boss in England always said to me, Mr. Drucker, you don't understand. If the good Lord had wanted to create an intelligent critter, he would have created it. It is not thinking, not easy. But yes, in many ways, it is harder today, no doubt, to stand out the way Senator Flanders did 40 years ago, the way Eleanor Roosevelt did 60 years ago. You women, the great women were in the 30s. They were fabulous. We have no woman leader today who can compare with them. And Eleanor Roosevelt, Frances Perkins, Lillian Hellman in the theater, Dorothy Thompson in journalism, Helen Taussig in medicine, nothing like it. But there were very few, and they were very lonely, terribly lonely. I knew a few of them. And today we have a great many. It is much harder for a woman to be that distinct, because there are so many. But does it mean that the quality has gone down? No. It only means that it is much harder to stand out. If you look at the Senate, there are some exceedingly able people in it, very able. But it is much harder to stand out. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
This is going to have to be our last question, given the press of time, and we'll go to our left, your right.
Thank you. My name is Virginia Long, and it's my pleasure to be here at the Kennedy School as a part of the program for senior officials in national security. In 1987, the Harvard Business Review published your article, The Coming of the New Organization, which predicted that future large businesses would be flatter organizationally. And you made reference to some of that article in your discussion about the symphony. The current administration, in the National Performance Review, is seeking a reinvention of government for a smaller and organizationally flatter entity. In your opinion, do you think the federal government, with its many layers of organization and the career ladders of the professional workforce, will be able to achieve this goal? Or will the current bureaucracy reestablish itself after a short period of time without significant change?
I don't think this question can be answered by more than, at best, a guess. What I have seen so far does not make me very optimistic. So far I've read a great many speeches and little else. One reason is, let me say, a government has to be bureaucratic or it becomes a den of thieves. Look, here are people modestly paid and enormous sums pass through their hands. And if you don't have enormous controls, it becomes a den of thieves. The disproportion between the money they handle and their own incomes is simply too great. And that creates a control system. I have not worked with our government, but I worked with the English civil service the last 5 years. They are talking of slimming down to 5,000 civil servants from 250,000. The rest to be employed in semi-autonomous, quangos, quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organizations, agencies, which are, in many cases, supposed to raise their own budget. But they are not going to be fewer levels or less bureaucratic. And so I think that, yes, I don't know about reinventing government, but re-engineering government may be a better term, is not, I think, going to be very many fewer layers. It may be clearer functions. It may be a clearer distinction between government as a policymaker and government as a doer. Where we mix those two things up in an agency, it doesn't quite work. I have been working with the Pentagon for many, many years. I can assure you it doesn't quite work. But it may mean sorting out what government does well and what government doesn't do well, and how to contract out what government doesn't do well. But for government to become something that isn't government is that's basically a sex change.
On that note, I think we have to end the formal program here. I thank you all for coming. I thank Professor Drucker for sharing his thoughts. Thank you.